Welcome back to the 8th episode of the EcoFlow podcast. This is Jane logging in, and today I'm going to release the second part of my interview with Cody Abbey on the things that we can learn from rural education work in China. In this second part of the interview, we're going to explore the two-teacher system that they've been implementing in rural China, as well as questions such as whether education technology is narrowing or expanding the urban-rural education gap. We also talked about spiritual and material civilization and advice for parents during this pandemic lockdown for their kids. If you've missed the first part, you can always find it on my YouTube channel, or if you just want the audio version of it, it's available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and other platforms. Please enjoy. Do you think China would be doing a better job during this period of time than any other countries in closing that gap because of this investment in EdTech? Because from here in Malaysia, when we watch the news, they kept reporting about how Chinese kids are learning through apps or app in China right now. But in Malaysia, people are still doing things sort of ad hoc or by themselves in different ways. Like, okay, this school's teacher is doing it through Zoom or through this way, and everyone's not really unified in a single system, and the government is not investing so much resources on education technology. And so I see a lot of kids, like maybe they're, for this past 4 months, they're just playing at home and just hanging out, and whereas maybe in China, like the kids are, both city kids and rural kids are getting this similar sort of education for this period of time.
Yeah, well, I think I don't know what the situation is like in Malaysia. I'd say in China, what we're seeing is that there are a lot of centralized resources. That's certainly the case, but we're still not sure if they're effective, right? We're still not sure, and if this teacher who's using this PowerPoint they found on this huge database, right? Is this an effective? Does it have an effect? Is it as effective if they were doing it face to face? Is it more effective? Is it less effective? We still don't know. And I think that if it's rural teachers who are carrying out these interventions, well, it's a little bit of a worry, because rural teachers, they no offense against rural teachers, but overall, obviously, rural teachers just can't teach as well as urban teachers for a variety of reasons. So if they're going to start venturing into EdTech, they suddenly have to put on the EdTech app and figure out, well, how am I going to use my computer to teach this lesson, or how am I going to send this lesson over cell phone and start grading, with my cell phone, or how do I even manage the class over the computer when the kids probably just want to go outside and play anyway, but they can't go outside because it's quarantine. So they're going to find some other way to entertain themselves, even though they're supposed to be paying attention to the lesson. There are all these factors that could have influenced the kids' education. That I don't necessarily think that China, although China was successful in making sure that all teachers were engaged in some way in this education, that it was necessarily very effective, right? It might have not even been that much more effective than not teaching at all. We just don't know, right?
Okay.
So I think definitely kudos to China for its organization of the teachers and getting them together to do this. But so many teachers were not experienced before. There are hardware connectivity problems. There are all these issues that we have to think about. And I think one really important question is, so I organized with my team this webinar recently. I sent it about first of all, what was the effect of COVID-19 on education in rural China, and what's the future of essentially it wasn't really the topic, but it ended up being a subtopic, was what is the future of EdTech in China, in rural China. And we invited this NGO besides our academic, lectures. We invited this NGO
Mm.
to talk, and what they do is it's called 双师, right? So 双师means two teacher system.
Mm-hmm.
It's not really a good English translation for it, actually. I haven't really seen, very good, because I think in English we don't really call it that. But essentially what it is that there is an urban teacher, or not necessarily an urban teacher, but like maybe a company employee teacher often, right? So in China, there are these huge education companies that
Mm-hmm.
tons of resources, and often the kids that they serve, and this is getting into my point, is our kids who are in urban areas that are like first and second tier cities. But in any case, so this company has, it's called Xindongfang. So it's
新东方.
called New Oriental, yeah,
Mm-hmm.
and New Oriental and the other large conglomerate in China, which is called TAL. It's called Haoweilai in Chinese. So these two
Mm-hmm.
companies, they have a foundation that's called Jingshan. And so this foundation, the Qingxi Yuanshan Foundation, uh, engages in the two teacher system. And what that means is that they have an urban teacher or a company employed teacher teaching kids over Zoom or
Mm-hmm.
some sort of similar software, um, English or Chinese, right, or math. And it's called a double teacher system because it takes place in their actual classroom. Like
Mm-hmm.
the teacher, their rural teacher, their actual classroom teacher, will engage somewhat with the kids, but not in the actual transmission of information, but rather in classroom management and maybe uh, maybe inciting a little bit of or organizing some classroom discussion or giving some one-to-one feedback, or obviously setting up the computer. So this is this new two teacher system, and the head of this organization, the secretary general, Mishu Zhang in Chinese, of
Mm-hmm.
this NGO or foundation, he gave the rationale for this, and I thought this was really interesting. He said, he gave a little background. He said, is EdTech narrowing the gap between urban and rural areas, or is it widening
Widen.
the gap?
Uh-huh.
Right? I thought that was actually a question we had posed to all the speakers beforehand, but I think he was really the only one who really, I think, directly tried answer that question. And it was interesting too, because he was in the nexus between China's um, educational industry, right, private companies that make tons
Uh-huh.
of money off of urban kids,
Mm-hmm.
and the nonprofit, this foundation that tries to serve rural kids. And what he said was, can you guess what he said? Can you guess, it narrow or does it widen? I'm just interested in what you think.
I think it could widen as well.
Widen, yeah, and that's what he
Yeah.
said. Widen, and why did he say widen? Well, he actually gave some statistics, right, of these two companies,
Uh-huh.
and the kids that use the software of their various products, right? They've got
Uh-huh.
so many products for all different years, for all different curricula, and what they found was almost like less. I think it was less than 10%. I'd have to look at the statistics again, but definitely less than 20% of all of their users
Uh-huh.
were users that were in um, fourth tier cities or below. And I'd have to look at the statistic again, but essentially almost over half of their users were in first or second tier cities,
Uh-huh.
which are very, not a very large portion of China's population, right? You've got
Yeah.
50% of China's population in rural areas,
Mm-hmm.
and yet of that, of the 50% of kids, right? 50%, and yet only like maybe 5 or 10% of their users were in rural areas. It was actually so stark of a contrast
Yeah.
that they did not even include rural areas. They had fifth tier cities, right, which isn't technically rural. That's not. I don't know what that would even technically be, but it's a city, right? So that's not even including rural areas. So they didn't have. So the rural area participants may have been less than 1%. They didn't even bother to include it in their statistics. And so his point was that no, clearly rural EdTech is not closing the gap in
Yeah.
China. It's actually widening it. And so that was super interesting to me.
Uh-huh.
And so what was interesting, and I think this is something we'd really like to evaluate in the future, is this two teacher system, because as I said before, right, there's all these rural teachers that are leaving, where so many teachers don't want to go to rural China to teach.
Mm-hmm.
And what this double teacher system offers is that you can essentially address the supply and demand mismatch, right? So
Mm-hmm.
there's so many rural kids, there's not enough rural teachers or good rural teachers. So you can, at almost no cost, right, you can basically allow these rural kids access to urban teacher, or to these like high quality educational teaching
Mm-hmm.
resources. And so it's a really interesting experiment. And there's actually this article. I don't want to keep going on and on, but there's this
For
article
sure.
that was super viral in China. I don't know if you read it, and it was about this company, but like it was a company or like an NGO backed by a company, I think, that in Chengdu, that was allowing kids in rural Yunnan, right? So that's in
Mm-hmm.
southwestern China. It's somewhat, it's
Yep.
poorer than a lot of other places in China. Access to Chengdu, which is a fairly large city, their best high school, which is Chengdu Qizhong, and I actually taught there one summer, but
Mm-hmm.
and allowing them to, and I'm not saying that because I'm like a great teacher or anything, but it was cool that I got to teach there one summer. Program.
It's really
Um,
humble.
yeah. So they're allowing these kids in rural Yunnan
Mm.
in high school to gain access to these teachers at this top high school in Chengdu. And essentially they would put a camera in the Chengdu classroom, and so the Yunnan these poor rural kids, they can see in their classroom virtually what the Chengdu classroom looks like,
Mm-hmm.
and the teacher teaching, and so their teacher, the rural teacher, would put that on, and they would watch this, uh, and essentially it said in the article that so many kids went to the top schools after participating in this distance education program,
Ooh.
uh, or double teacher but no, nobody's evaluated it.
Uh-huh. Okay.
So it can be a viral article. They can say that there are this many kids that went to these universities, but we don't know if it was because of that. It might have been, but we don't know for sure that was because of that program. So yeah, so definitely not in a nutshell, but I've talked for quite a long time about this already, about EdTech,
Mm-hmm.
and that's sort of what I do and what we're doing.
Mm-hmm. Just a quick comment. I felt like what the guy just said about widening the gap from a private company's perspective, that and from their statistics, that should be correct because they're selling their products, right? And I bet the people who are buying their products are mainly from urban
Oh yeah.
parents and forcing their kids to take such courses. And maybe they market it to their target audience, which is rich parents who would pay for such courses, right? And so I think you guys are doing a really important job in competing with these huge private tech companies and coming up with equally good quality programs that could be easily accessible to rural kids.
Yeah, and I mean, that's part of our goal, right? It is to come up with some interventions that work. But often, I think our strength, right, at REAP, and I'm sure Scott would agree with this, is my boss
Mm-hmm.
Scott,
Uh-huh.
is that our strength is really in evaluating. So although we also would love to come up with products like computer assisted learning is one of ours, but um, to a large extent, if there's something that already works that's out there and they're willing to give it for free
Yeah.
to rural kids, then we're all for that, right? We don't necessarily have to be the one that comes up with it, but we just want to make sure it works.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but as you said, that's totally right. Yeah, I mean, the reason, one of the reasons, right? We can't say that's the only reason,
Mm. Yeah.
but one of the reasons that these rural kids can't access the software is that it's expensive. And yeah, I mean, these educational softwares. Some of my friends in Beijing, they can't even afford
Mm.
some of the educational software platforms, right? Like English learning platforms that are out there that are
Yeah.
like thousands of yuan, every month. It's really hard for many people to afford. So that's certainly one of the reasons. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What is one thing that the RIP program had taught you or did for rural kids that you didn't expect? Oh.
Yeah. So I think one thing I already talked about, and you talked about a little bit, I think, um, was the importance of early childhood development, right?
Mm-hmm.
These are just things that I just hadn't thought of before. I'd always been thinking from the school perspective, right? Oh, it's because the teachers, right? It's because there must be something wrong with the school resources. There's not enough, or it must start later in life. That's sort of what I always had considered, but a lot of us hadn't been exposed to some of those the literature that says that actually it's the first 1,000 days, 1,000 day hypothesis,
Mm-hmm.
where the brain forms, and that this parenting is so vital. And it wasn't just that. Like, there are also other things that I didn't realize was so important, and you also talked about, right? Intestinal worms. But intestinal worms we've actually found isn't quite as important in recent research, or anemia.
Oh.
Our past research said that was really a big problem. I think that's getting better and better, right? There are fewer cases of anemia, which is caused by a lack of essentially iron. So
Mm-hmm.
that's a lack of certain foods like meat and vegetables.
Mm-hmm.
That's starting to improve across China. I think one of our biggest effect sizes, right? So when we're talking about experimental economics, talk about how big is the effect size.
Mm-hmm.
And almost, I'd say, because our early child development research is still producing results, which are quite large, but I think because we've done so many years with our vision project, that's probably our most established and proven project to really improve kids' grades. So a lot of kids in rural China just don't wear glasses,
Mm.
and they, why don't they wear glasses? There's so many reasons why they don't wear glasses, but um, what we've done is that we've found that when kids wear glasses, their grades are going to increase if they,
Yeah.
they're I always forget which is it. It's if they're no, if they're nearsighted.
Nearsighted.
Uh, yeah, if they're myopic, their grades will improve by 20 points, right? If they wear glasses,
Mm-hmm.
and if they don't. And so what we did was we started up this social enterprise to sell glasses to families and the cities that can afford to pay for them, and then sell or to donate classes to rural kids that needed them, and
Mm-hmm.
establish these like vision testing centers in these smaller in the rural schools where the teachers could do the vision testing and then report to the vision centers we set up. Oh, these are these kids that are myopic, and then they would come and get their own pair of glasses. So that's essentially another thing that we've done that's really important. Yeah, so I think that's all of this research that I didn't really consider before to be important for rural education. This has become, I think, something that a big lesson. Another lesson, obviously, is that at REAP, what we find is that you have to test things, right? You can't. There's so many NGOs out there that they have great projects, and they have great teams, and they really care about the issues that they work on, but they don't necessarily know if what they're doing is effective.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're going to spend all those resources, you're going to spend all that time trying to make a difference, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's might as well know if it's effective or not. And there's different ways of measuring that, but especially for like increasing academic performance, you have to go through randomized control trials. There's a few other ways of doing it that are kind of also somewhat acceptable,
Mm-hmm.
that are semi-experimental essentially, but it's really the gold standard of showing whether something is effective or not. So that would
Mm-hmm.
probably be the second thing. And when
Mm-hmm.
it comes from I guess rural kids, what have I found? Um, Well, I mean, a lot of what I've seen in rural China is it's funny. Like some things have changed a lot, and some things haven't.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so when I first started teaching in the rural countryside, I mean, my what I see is very different from somebody who's Chinese would see possibly, or because I'm going in there as a foreigner. I look very different. So I think so much of what rural kids, what they see, they see me as like this sort of alien type of figure that they're a little bit afraid of, but they also really want to get to know.
Uh-huh.
And when I go to China, rural China, still, that's always still the case.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes I'll have like kids following me around. The entire school might follow me around or be looking at me. So I think that's that kind of, and what that teaches me is that these rural kids, they still have a lot. Um, they haven't been outside of their uh, outside of this rural region that they're a part of, and that they're a bit closed off from the outside world. Uh, and but I think that what I've seen though is that a lot of rural kids are actually quite satisfied with the way that they experience life. I'm trying to think of a good way to describe what I mean by this. So recently we had a conversation with um, a principal
Mm-hmm.
at this rural school in it's called Liangshan, and Liangshan is very poor, very, very poor area in Sichuan. It's an ethnic minority region, and she was actually, I think, a a volunteer teacher who became principal of this rural school. So it was a little bit interesting of a situation because you don't generally see volunteer teachers become principals. But
Mm.
um, she said some things to us. Right, so they're at this very poor in this very poor region where these kids have fairly simple lives. They don't have a lot of the material, like I guess, comforts that a lot of people might have,
Mm-hmm.
in the U.S. or urban China.
Yeah.
Uh, and she said this one comment to us. I was almost shocked that she said this. Actually, that I think I've never really considered that a principal would do this. So what she said was, "Oh, a lot of NGOs want to give us donations, and just to back this up with some background. How did we find this teacher? Well, first of all, we had started our computer assisted learning program at the school, right? So that
Mm-hmm.
was one reason
Okay.
we knew this teacher. But she had also done a whole bunch of videos on these small what's called in English, I forgot the name. Actually, ByteDance, right? ByteDance, Douyin. I
Uh-huh.
think on Douyin, right? So she had her own channel.
Okay.
Um, like basically give these 1 minute videos about the situation at her rural school,
Mm-hmm.
and and they were very, very popular. And so she got a lot of attention. A lot of a lot of NGOs or people wanted to donate clothes and other items. And so she said that she didn't want the clothes. She said that she didn't want the kids to have the clothes to receive the clothes. And I was that's so strange. Um, and then we asked her obviously, well, why would you say that? And she said that she would always give the clothes away to other schools because she said that my kids don't need to feel like they're entitled. Like they just need to realize that they actually have a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, where they are.
Yeah.
They already are really fortunate. They don't need to be envious of people who live in the city. They don't need to be envious of people who live in America, right? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I was American talking to her, so that's why she brought up
Yeah.
America.
Uh-huh.
But she said that they have all they really need where they are,
Uh-huh.
and I thought that was really really touching. But I had never really imagined that a school would reject a donation for and give it to other schools. It's
Mm-hmm.
not something I expected. So yeah, that I think that what really brought home to me, and I think what that taught me is that, and this is obviously the principal talking. She can't talk on behalf of the kids per se. But
Yeah.
what she said, what I saw at that school, and what I've seen in rural China is that kids tend to be very happy in
Mm-hmm.
general. Right, there
Mm-hmm.
are certainly mental health issues in every school.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Left behind children, don't have parents at home. That's also it's also a huge problem. But
Mm-hmm.
um, I think just because you go to a school that doesn't necessarily have a lot of resources, or doesn't have the best curriculum or the best teachers, doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be any less happy. And I think a lot of rural kids have uh, they've learned to just appreciate what they have, and I think that's
Mm-hmm.
something so valuable that you also mentioned this in your the video that you sent,
Yeah.
that the kids in Ladakh also, um, they are somewhat closed off from the world, but they've learned to really appreciate what they have, and
Yeah.
they're able to live a simpler lifestyle, and maybe they're even happier because of it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah, so I think that's sort of what I learned is that kids in rural China, we have lots that we can learn from them. Appreciation about not necessarily needing all the material comforts
Yeah.
um, in life.
What the principal said is something that I personally subscribe to, and that's
Mhm.
how I felt when I bring people to rural villages in the Himalayas. And it's also because I've read a book called Ancient Futures, and I would definitely send you the PDF file for
Yeah.
this book. In fact, I have like 50 copies of this book in Ladakh, which I forgot to bring it back, or else I could have just give it to you as a present.
Uh,
But we force or enforce all our participants who join our retreats to read this book before coming, because um, so the author of Ancient Futures is a Swedish linguist. Her name is Helena Norbert Hodge, and she runs a really powerful NGO called Local Futures, I think. And she's really adamant about localizing economies and on creating an economy that puts the welfare of people above everything, or the well-being of people above greed, above just material production, above GDP. and and she got this idea from Ladakh because she visited Ladakh in the 70s when it was just right before it was opened up to the world, or just right after it was opened up to the world. So Ladakh for a very long time was cut off from even the rest of India because they didn't have like a good infrastructure, a road that could lead people from the plains to the mountains in the Himalayas. And so they were building the roads, and by the 70s, they finally opened it up. And when she arrived, she saw a very utopian society in Ladakh where people were living very happily in the agrarian society. People were farming and families were very sustainable. There were no plastics. People were producing enough food, and because they have like milk, they have yaks, they have what was that, barley, lots of barley. So they had a pretty good mix of food as well, and people were just happy, really happy. And so she learned the language, learned the culture, talked to people, and 10 years later or 20 years later, when she came back again, but she's been going back year after year, and she saw how it changes over time when people bring in the idea of Western capitalism, and they started bringing in goods, materials. Foreigners flock into Ladakh, but when they do so, they also bring in, um, clothings. They bring in all kinds of fancy stuff, and they start giving out, like money to people. And when people in Ladakh started giving up farming to set up like businesses, shops in Leh, which is the capital of Ladakh, the ancient capital city of Ladakh, they become dependent on the capitalistic money-based economy. And over time, people start comparing themselves with one another in terms of wealth, in terms of what they wear, in terms of how much money they have. And so it starts to destroy relationships between people. And yeah, these days, if you go to rural Ladakh, you can still see the same sort of agrarian society, but at the same time, you can also see the effect of capitalism slowly seeping into every corner in this world, I bet. And so when I bring people to this nomadic village that we went to, and to this school, I actually asked them to not buy them like snacks, or plastic toys, because they would just play with the toy and they don't know how to recycle it or discard of it. And it also creates sort of like a sense of lack in them, that they need this in order to be happy. So that's what I felt as well. As long as they have the basic necessity to have a fairly comfortable life, and for that I meant like comfortable clothes to withstand the winter. When people want to donate winter clothes to the kids, I would support that. And they have enough food. If they donate funds to support the food, the clothing, books, education, then I would support them, or I would recommend them to bring such things instead of buying all sorts of material things for the kids.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. It's funny. It's sort of a difficult issue, right? I read what we're focused on is we're trying to improve, rural students' grades so they can go to better schools, and so that they can, achieve in life. But I think there's also another side to that, and I'm not saying like this is a wrong, direction at all,
Mm-hmm.
but because of that, right? We're trying to make sure that they have the ability or the resources or the educational achievements so that they can go to the cities, so that they can get a good job.
Mm-hmm.
And I think for most people that is what they would want. But with that, I think the caveat is with that there are also all these other I guess externalities or these potential consequences that come with leaving a rural, a simpler lifestyle.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not saying that it's wrong. I think overall the direction is right. That
Uh-huh.
we try to move in, and that I think overall there is that pressure on rural society in China that you need to move, you need to become successful, you need to get a job, you need to make money, and I think you need money to survive,
Yeah.
and you need a certain amount of money to be happy.
Mm-hmm.
So you can't completely reject the idea of the necessity of these financial resources or material resources, as you said, right? You need the winter clothes. You
Mm-hmm.
gotta get those winter clothes, otherwise it's just going to be a pretty difficult winter to get through.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, so I think there's that caveat is that when you're trying to open up, right?
Yeah.
I don't want to seem too like Orientalist or something, but when you're trying to expose kids who have less exposure to other parts of the world or even other parts of their own country,
Mm-hmm.
you're trying to improve their grades. You're trying to you're trying to make sure that they have a better path in life. You also have to think about, well, the more that we expose them to this, the more that they may also encounter, comparisons with other people, or materialism, or all of these other, I think, parts of life, parts of being human,
Mm-hmm.
um, that is even, particularly magnified when we live in, cities where there's a lot of competition between people, or there's more materialism. And
Mm-hmm.
it's up to every individual to try to figure out how to deal with that, and how they want to deal with that. But I think also, um, when we try to do these interventions, whether it's in the Himalayas, or
Mm-hmm.
whether it's rural China, or somewhere else, right? It's also important to keep that in mind, and to maybe even include that as part of the curriculum, as like a reminder,
Mm-hmm.
that what although it's really important to improve and to grow and to explore the world, that um, sometimes what you need isn't necessarily more
Mm-hmm.
what you have already.
Yeah. In China, when I was studying international relations in Peking, I remember in the Chinese politics class, there was was it Mao Zedong or one of the, or Zhou Enlai, or one of the top leaders, who said that, the more China progress in terms of the 物质文明, material civilization, you also have to develop its Jingshan 文明, the
Mm.
spiritual aspect of the civilization. And today we see a lot of Asian countries trying to emulate the Western model of becoming quick and rich. And they're only copying the material sort of civilization part of it. And then we see a lot of people in the West that are unhappy with life and who are finding 精神文明 in the Eastern, sort of the Eastern part of the world.
Yeah.
And people are going back to farming in nature, like in Byron Bay, or in rural parts of North America. And I believe it's really important for the East to know that as well, to know that the Western system is not perfect, and that people are seeking wisdom in Eastern tradition as well.
Yeah, that's so beautiful. I think that I mean, you need a balance, right? I think you have to realize that I don't know. I think as a Western, I think the spiritual aspect is really something that we need to work on. I don't know about the East, quote unquote, and I don't know about Malaysia, whether it's, do people need more spiritual um,
Mm-hmm.
aspect to their life, or is it material? But I think definitely, where we live, I think spiritual is certainly something that if you don't have it, it's really, I guess spiritual means something different to everyone.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, it could mean, right. I mean, you and I think we're both really into mindfulness.
Yeah.
It could, that spiritual aspect is, or that anchor, right, is maybe the present moment, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's a quote by Thich Nhat Hanh,
Yeah.
um, that I think it was like something about tea, and it was about like hold your tea, or sip your tea as if it was I don't quite remember that part of the quote, but then the second part of the quote is that uh, it is only this moment that is life, or something like that. Like this moment is all that is life, or life is only this moment.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing else matters, right? Nothing before this matters. Nothing after this matters. I just think, if you forget about that, it's so easy to drift away from, I guess, a healthy spiritual type of lifestyle. But for other people, it might not be the present moment per se. It might
Mm-hmm.
be like, it might be God, it might be religion, it might
Yep.
be some sort of greater power, which
Mm-hmm.
is totally cool too. And I think that
Mm-hmm.
works for a lot of my friends who are religious. And it depends on what you believe. Maybe there is an objective reality out there regarding that, but regardless of that, I think yeah, I think I totally agree with you that at least I think people around where I live, I think, if people had more of a spiritual aspect to their life,
Mm-hmm.
not only would we be happier, but I think, the communities would be a little bit more harmonious,
Mm-hmm.
to use a more Chinese word, and there would be less conflict, as much conflict as there is now
Yeah.
today in our
Mm-hmm.
society.
I also find it a little bit ironic that it's only when the West take up a certain concept and make it hip and popularize it, and then the East starts buying that idea again, like mindfulness. The funny thing
Mm.
is, the a lot of Westerners are learning about mindfulness, like from Thich Nhat Hanh, from this Eastern masters, and then now you see a lot of mindfulness teachers going around, even in Asia, teaching mindfulness courses. And I'm not saying it's wrong or anything, but
Yeah,
at the same time, which is quite admirable, that I guess because Westerners have a really good way of packaging and marketing an idea and maybe dissecting it down into different parts and making it sort of systemized. And whereas in Eastern tradition, traditionally, it's more of like a very Confucianistic way, and different schools are doing things in their own way. And the West is just really smart in taking a certain concept, combining it with science, systemize it, and then market it to the world.
maybe, yeah.
Yeah.
A friend of mine recently, he asked me like, uh, U.S. has people like Steve Jobs, Elon Musk, um, because recently I think there was the what's it called, um,
SpaceX.
SpaceX, yeah,
Mm-hmm.
the success of that mission. So he asked, why does the U.S. have so many of these types of people, right? And I
Uh-huh.
think he was other parts of the world don't have it. I don't necessarily think that's true. I mean, there's certainly so many um, influential thinkers and innovators that every country I think has them.
Mm-hmm.
In the U.S., they tend to be a little bit more famous, I guess, in the world. Why is that? Um, yeah, I think I'm not totally sure about the answer. I think what you just mentioned, the ability to market, well, certainly we're certainly a very capitalist society here. So
Mm-hmm.
I think that competition is fairly high in the U.S. There's
Mm-hmm.
quite a bit of competition that incentivizes people, and there's a lot of innovative centers in the U.S. Where people, what San Francisco, Bay Area, New York City,
Mm-hmm.
um, when you've got a lot of other minds that are passionate and innovative and competitive, 'cause I
Mm-hmm.
think there is a part of that aspect to really make you very productive. I think that will enable you to have higher, like create more innovations. But I think overall, I think definitely there are a lot of things that the West can learn from the East. I think there's so much that I've learned from Chinese people, for instance,
Mm-hmm.
um, and people from other countries in Asia, from you. So there's certainly quite a lot to be learned across borders,
Mm-hmm.
and I don't think Americans should think that we're um, we're that much more special. I mean, I love living in America. I respect, I really admire. I'm very proud to be American, and I want the best for my country. But I also feel
Mm-hmm.
like there's so much that we can learn from other countries as well. And I think that I think more of us should realize that. I think that sometimes Americans tend to forget that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I think let's just wrap it up with one last question. So there's a lot of people under lockdown right now,
Yeah.
and I was just thinking, can you maybe give some advice to parents in general if you're listening to this? Like, what would you, as someone who works for REAP and deriving all those lessons from REAP that you just gave a while ago, what would you recommend people do during this time, this period of time when they're at home, or when their kids are still not going to school? What can they do for the betterment of their own children?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I can't say that I'm an expert per se in raising kids. So I'd say definitely, first of all, to any parents that might be listening, um, definitely trust your own instincts. But I think just from I guess research at REAP and what we found, and what we found to be important
Mm-hmm.
um, in education in general. I think there's two sides. If you're a parent that's not necessarily in China because they're not locked down anymore, but in other countries,
Mm-hmm.
I think there's two aspects, right? That you want to make sure that the kid um, doesn't fall super behind. That this doesn't turn into be like a virtual summer vacation, in which research has shown that kids will regress incredibly significantly during their summer vacations in terms of their academic progress. And
Mm-hmm.
that's just the case pretty much everywhere. It's a natural part of, I guess, the school calendar. But I think there's that aspect, but I also think there's the mental health aspect, and we're starting to do a little bit more research regarding mental health. We've done some in the past in rural China, and I think that there needs to be a balance, like everything, right?
Mm-hmm.
So um, I think the child probably will need some reminders. Maybe if they don't have a set schedule, that they should uh, maybe log on at a certain time to connect that behavior with something else as well.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so if it's they're supposed to eat breakfast around a certain time, then after breakfast maybe that'll make it easier. After breakfast, you should log on and study this, and to give them goals, right, objectives. As a teacher, um, what's most important is to give kids objectives, and I think ultimately you want to get them to be self-regulating, right? You want them to be able to themselves be making goals, or just at least sticking to their goals, and to monitor their progress.
Mm-hmm.
But initially, especially for younger kids, I think they're definitely going to need help both forming that habit and figuring out how to do monitoring. And I think the monitoring might, for younger kids, still have to mostly come from the parents.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Parents certainly have to take a bit of responsibility, maybe that teachers normally will have, um, and I think otherwise it would be very hard for a lot of, especially younger kids, to be focused and concentrated. But I think there's also that other aspect. It's not just about studying; it's about also making sure that your kid, during this really difficult time, is not is happy, right, and is enjoying their experience at home, and I think that is also really important. So not putting too much pressure on them to stick to a very strict schedule, and make sure that there's breaks, making sure that they have some social interaction time and some time to pursue their hobbies.
Mm-hmm.
um, I think that's really important. So I think that would just be some really general advice, is just to
Mm-hmm.
not forget, the mental health aspect, nor forget, the academic progress. They're really important, both. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much, Cody. I think
Yes, thank you.
it's such a good interview, and even I myself have learned so much from just what you have shared with me today. And for those folks who are still listening out there, there's definitely going to be a second episode to this, and because we haven't really go into Cody's background or your childhood, or um, what sparked your interest in China, and a bunch of other cool questions that I sent you beforehand, and also some of my fire questions. We'll save that for next episode. So thank you so much for coming up today and for waking up so early in the morning. It's close to midnight here in Malaysia.
Yeah, I'm sure
And
you're exhausted after your long day, so definitely go hit the sack. Um,
you know what? When I get into really interesting conversations, when we get into this flow state, right? You just get so much adrenaline rushing your body, and all those other neurochemicals that I don't feel sleepy anymore, and I might even have a hard time falling asleep. That's why I
Yeah.
prepared some stress relief tea here.
You'll do a little meditation. I think you'll be fine. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. Maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah. Or yoga.
Uh-huh.
Yoga. Yeah. But thanks so much, Jin. It was
Mhm.
really great, and love talking over this. And definitely, if you want to do it again, just let me know. We can organize
Okay.
time.
I hope you had a good time. So thank you so much for listening to the very end of the interview. I hope you guys enjoyed it. And if you find this helpful and useful, do share it with other people. And it would be really kind of you if you could write a review or give a rating on Apple iTunes so that it can reach out to more people. And I hope I get to see you in our next conversation. Ciao.